I'm Kirk Williamson, president of the Columbia Basin Badger Club. Welcome to today's special Badger Forum, Empty Planet. The Badger Club was founded in 2008 over a backyard barbecue. The idea was to provide a community forum for vigorous but civil discussion of important topics of the day. The Badger Club is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. A special thanks to our volunteer members of the program committee, especially David Larkin, who championed this forum. We appreciate all of our volunteers, as well as our sponsor partners, the Tri-City Herald, Mid-Columbia Libraries, Columbia Basin College, the League of Women Voters, and the Journal of Business. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a member of our program committee, Jason Valentine, who will be the moderator for today's program. Jason, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Kirk, and good afternoon, everyone. As Kirk suggested in his open, we have a very special Badger Club speaker today. He is Dr. Darrell J. Bricker, author of a number of best-selling books and co-author of the book, Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, which is the topic of today's program. Dr. Bricker is the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, headquartered in Australia, but with offices around the world. Ipsos is the world's leading social and opinion research firm. Prior to joining Ipsos, Bricker was Director of Public Opinion Research in the Office of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada. He holds a PhD in political science from Carleton University. Dr. Bricker is a frequent and popular public speaker who has also appeared on television and on all the Canadian networks, as well as CNN, the BBC, and NPR. He joins us today from Toronto, where he lives with his wife and daughter. Dr. Bricker, I've read your book in preparation for this interview. It is very thought-provoking and actually shocking to me, and I'm sure it will generate a number of questions from our viewers. Now, without any further comments from me, let me introduce Dr. Darrell Bricker.
Thanks a lot, Jason. And I just one quick correction. I actually was Director of Research for Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, not Justin Trudeau. So it was quite a while ago that I was doing that. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so you can see my slides. Because what's a presentation without slides? And what I'd like to talk to you about today is a topic I love. Demography is destiny. And it really brings to mind a great quote from an American author, Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And this is one of those topics in which there's a lot of people who think that they know what's going on in terms of population change in the world, but actually have the direction and the magnitude of it quite wrong. And I'll show you what the actual direction is, and we can talk about it when we get to the Q&A. So what are we really told about the future? That we're going to live through a population dystopia. The population bomb is going to explode. Remember Paul Ehrlich back in 1968 talking about how we were going to outlive all of our resources in the world and we wouldn't be able to feed the planet anymore? Well, it's supposed to be that way right now, and it certainly isn't. We're about 8 billion people today. The UN says we're going to get to about 10.4 billion, although they revised it down by 100 million last week by 2100. Reason for this, we're having just too many babies. We have unsustainable population growth that is going to destroy our planet. And this dystopian view is not only dominating a lot of podiums these days in many forums, but it's even dominating things like popular entertainment, where you hear this same meme over and over again. And for people who are in the world of marketing and are interested in selling products and services to consumers, or even political options to voters, the power of youth is going to dominate our future. They're everybody's top priority market. And as Mark Twain said, it just ain't so. It's all in the numbers, which I'm going to share with you as we go through this presentation. And what we're going to talk about today is demographics. Sounds like a really boring topic, but I assure you it is not. It's a fascinating topic. This gentleman, Auguste Comte, a French late Enlightenment philosopher, was the one who coined this phrase, demography is destiny. In other words, if you know the demographic structure and direction of a population, you know an awful lot about its future. And I think Auguste Comte was pretty much right.
Darrell, I apologize for interrupting, but we are not seeing your screen.
Really? Okay, and show. I don't know why that would be.
I just double checked at this end and
Okay, I'm sharing again.
now we're in business.
Okay, and I'll go back to where I was.
Thank you.
So I'm going to show you quickly the slides that you missed. So Mark Twain, you heard what I had to say about him. All the things about population dystopia, that we're going to get to 10.4 billion people, not going to happen. That, as I said before, it just ain't so. And it's all in the numbers. And we're going to talk about demographics. And I mentioned Auguste Comte. Demography is destiny. And why is Comte right? Well, frankly, demographics, it's all about us. If we should understand anything in the world, it's the nature of our species. And we are a biological species. We're getting much better at measuring the direction of growth or shrinkage of that species, of that human population. The most important part in all of this is that the decisions have mostly already been made. They were made by your grandparents, they were made by your parents, and they're being made by you. And they mostly relate to the size of the family that you're going to have during your lifetime. When those decisions are made, the effects are pretty permanent, which makes them projectable. So you can mark on a calendar when certain things are going to happen based on the decisions that were made about the size of families. All of these things are facts, what I'm going to be talking to you about today. We can disagree about the speed at which they're going to transition and the levels at which things are going to get to, but the trends themselves are undeniable. Even the UN, which I disagree with an awful lot about in terms of their population projections, agrees about the direction of travel that I'm going to talk to you about, but they think the population is going to get bigger and the decline is going to happen slower than what I'm going to talk to you about today. The central thesis of Empty Planet is that the global population is going to peak mid-century and it's going to decline to where it is today or fewer people. And today the global population is about 8 billion people. And the reason for that is basically we've stopped having kids. And I'll walk you through the statistics on that so you can see what I'm talking about. This is the UN's projections for the future of the global population. That red arrow, looking from 1950 to 2100, the end of the century, that red arrow is that 10.3, 10.2 number. If their estimates about the number of children we're going to have during our lifetimes are proved to be accurate. But if we have half a child more on average per woman in the world, the population will grow to above 14 billion people, almost unsustainable. Whereas if we just have a half a child less per woman, our population is going to shrink to a much lower level than it is even today, just over 6 billion. So the number of children we have is the single most important variable in all of this. I'm going to talk to you today about 3 demographic forces, key demographic forces, and they are all linked and they're all causing what's happening today in terms of the evolution of human population. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is urbanization. The second one is its effect on fertility. And then the third, the effect of urbanization on fertility and what it does to population aging. So urbanization. The biggest migration in the world in human history is happening right now. And it's not people moving from one country to another. In fact, the number of people who don't live in the country in this world or who live outside of the country in which they were born in this world is only about 4%. So true migrants, people who leave from one country to go to another country, only about 4% of the global population. But there's a massive movement of people moving from rural and small town parts of the world to urban parts of the world. So in 1960, about a third of us lived in a major urban area. Today, that number is pushing up to 60%. By 2050, the UN tells us it's going to be about 68%, may even be more. So we're seeing this huge migration of people from the countryside to the cities. In the United States and in Canada, it's not so much to the cities as it is to the car commuting suburbs. This is the urbanization for the 10 most populous countries in the world. So as I said before, we've gone from 34% or a third to 57% today to 68% by 2050. These are the 10 most populous countries, as I said before, in the world. The most populous country these days is India. China is actually number 2 now. And you can see both of them have gone through significant growth spurts, the gray to the green. So in China, back in 1960, about 16% of the population lived in an urban area. Today it's 61. By 2050, it'll be 80. India, it's gone from 18 to 52, not quite as much as China. And by 2050, is not going to grow much more as an urban population, but still significantly. Actually, that number looks like it's probably wrong. The U.S. has been an urban population for a very long time, and if you go through all of the countries on the list, you see all of them are going through a very similar type of change in the distribution in the population. When I used to present this, the number 10 country on the list as the most populous was Japan. Today it's Mexico. And the reason is because Japan loses about 1 million people from its population every year. When we change urbanization, we change fertility. So when you live in rural areas and your economy is mostly subsistence, particularly agriculture, children are actually economic contributors to the family's income and wealth. Because even fairly young children can do all sorts of things in an agricultural economy. They can take care of livestock, they can do various chores around the farm, they can do things to help contribute to a family's wealth and resources. And as a result, people tend to have more of them. When you move to the city, the economics change completely. Children no longer are net economic contributors to their families. They actually become a cost, and they're a cost for a pretty long time, until at least they move out of their parents' households. So as a result, the economic logic is we would have fewer of them, which is exactly what does happen. The magic number when you look at fertility is 2.1. So that is the average number of children that a woman in any country has during her lifetime. So that would be 1 for herself, 1 for her partner, and a little bit extra for those children who don't grow into adulthood and can't have families of their own. So the number is 2.1. In the world today, that number is 2.3 and probably down to about 2.2. The global average back in 1960 was 4.7. So it's basically been cut in half over the space of just over 60 years. By 2050, the UN says it's going to get down to 2.2. It'll be lower than 2.2 in 2050. If you take a look at China, and these are just the UN's numbers that I'm using here, which, as I said before, I somewhat dispute. I'll walk you through some other numbers in just a second. China, the average fertility rate or birth rate in China back in 1960 was 4.5. Today, it's 1.2. India has gone from 5.9 to 2. The United States has gone from 3.6 to 1.7. And you can go through all of the top 10, and you only see a couple of countries that even have above replacement rate fertility. And those 2 countries are Pakistan and Nigeria, and Indonesia just on the bubble of dropping below replacement rate fertility. And if people aren't having lots of kids in these countries, there's no other place in the world that's big enough, and the amount of production of children would be big enough to offset the number that are being lost as a result of this pattern that I'm showing you. The actual number, and this is from the Chinese government rather than from the UN, and the UN will be adjusting its number, for Chinese fertility now is 1. Which is why 2 years ago, China's population tipped into decline, and that decline is only going to accelerate through the course of the 21st century. The lowest fertility rate in Indian history is being recorded right now at 2. They're also below replacement rate. But the replacement rate in India tends to be higher because infant mortality is higher. So true replacement rate in India is probably around 2.3 or 2.4. They're now at 2. Those are the world's 2 largest countries It's 36% of the global population. The United States today, lowest fertility rate in a century at 1.6. So why is fertility declining? I mentioned the effect of urbanization in terms of the economic rationalizations that we have about our families. That's having an effect. But the biggest effect is actually the effect it has on the lives of women. When women move from the countryside to the city and they decide to participate in the formal economy, a lot about their lives change. They have different role models of success for living their lives, and they adopt those role models. They start to participate in the formal economy. So as a result of that, they want to make sure that they maximize the opportunity that they have for their own personal income and empowerment, which means they stay in school for longer, which means if they do decide to get married, they do it much later than their grandmothers did. And if they do have children, they have them very quickly, right after getting married, and they only have a couple, and then they stop. So I'll give you an example of this. I'll use my own country because I know it best. That's Canada, but it's very similar to the United States. And that is the average Canadian woman got married in 1960 around the age of 21. She had her first child shortly after, and during her lifetime, she had 4. Today, the average Canadian woman gets married around the age of 30, if she gets married at all, and has, on average, 1.3 children. The most frequent number of children in any household in Canada today is 1. In 1960, it was 4. That's how much we've changed. There's a change in culture. We no longer regard having big families as being something that is either desirable or something that we admire. In fact, if you look at most of the cultural memes that you see out there, it's people with small families, not people with large families. There's been, particularly in the developing world, huge success of government and non-government organization programs in terms of reducing unwanted pregnancies, and it's had an effect. And the gender and age structure of the population is changing. That group of people we need in the population, which is younger women during the age in which they can actually have children, gets smaller and smaller every day as the population ages. And COVID-19, as I have called out here in red, was supposed to lead to a big boost in terms of fertility because people were going to stay home and do what we used to do when we were stuck in the house, but they didn't. In fact, uncertainty has a huge effect on whether or not people decide to have children, and they were feeling very uncertain during the pandemic. And as far as the economy is concerned, they're feeling very uncertain about the economy right now. And if you're not hopeful about the future, the likelihood that you're going to have children declines. And we're seeing the effect of all of that right now. So in fact, the decline of fertility has only accelerated over the last 5 years, which led to The Economist back in June of last year, referring now to the baby bust economy, how declining birth rates will change the world, and they are right. So if you reduce the number of children coming into the population, how does the population continue to grow? We don't die as fast as we used to. So we're seeing a rapid aging of the global population. So life expectancy back in 1960 was about 48 years of age. Today it's 73. In 2050, it should be 77. This is a huge addition to the lives of people around the world, and something that we should really celebrate. This is the effect of everything from more available food through to access to better medicine, to better lifestyle habits, reducing all of the different ways that people can die, either accidentally or as a result of external factors. We've done an amazing job of changing that, and as you see, it's added years to people's lives. But the issue with that is almost all of the population growth in the world today is coming from people not dying as fast as they used to. So back in China, the second most populous country in the world, in 1960, a person could only expect to live to about the age of 33. Remember, this was during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So there was a lot of starvation and other types of death that were happening in China. Today, the average Chinese person can expect to live to the age of 79. And if you go through all of these countries, you see a similar leap in terms of longevity. Nobody's moving in the other direction. Although I should say in the United States and in a few other countries, As a result of COVID, we did see some decline in terms of longevity, but that's not reversed itself in the most recent numbers. And I expect what you're going to see is continuing increase in levels of longevity around the world. So most of our population growth, as I said before today, is not coming from new people coming into the world. It's people not leaving the world as fast as they used to. And the causes of death that most contribute to the differences in life expectancy at birth globally for men and women. And the reason that I mention this is the world is becoming a more female place. And just a couple of quick facts about this. In any country in which there is no artificial intervention to determine the gender of a child through the process of pregnancy and being born, if there's no artificial intervention to create a specific gender in that child, there are always more boys born than girls. It's a slight ratio increase. In Canada, it's like 104 to 100. The United States is a similar type of number. There are some places where there are artificial interventions, and the male to female ratio is much higher, like China and India, for example. But in North America, it's a slight difference. By the time we get to the age of 40, that difference is gone. By the time we get to the age of 100, there are 5 women alive for every man that's alive. And the reason is because of the 20 reasons that anybody can die prematurely, 16 of them are more frequent among men. And the 4 that are more frequent among women are pretty much exclusively related to women. And you see them here in the yellow bars. So breast cancer, maternal conditions, child death and childbirth is still a huge cause of death around the world, although declining, cervical cancer and Alzheimer's, because women do tend to outlive men. One of the things that we always think on that is it's that older women outlive older men. No, it's women tend to outlive men at every age through our existence, because every reason that you can die earlier than you should be dying is because of the 16 things that are highlighted there in blue, and they relate to everything from heart disease through to road injury, through to anything that relates to cancer, all the things that you shouldn't do in order to have a long life: smoking, drinking, taking drugs, driving too fast, participating in activities, work activities, or leisure activities that have higher death rates, all much more frequent among men. Men are less likely to go to the doctor. Men are less likely to follow the doctor's directions. You know this whole pattern. And as a result, what you're seeing as the world as it ages is also becoming more female. There are more females alive in the United States today than there are males. And that gap continues to grow every year. So what we're doing these days is we're flipping the population pyramid. We usually look at population pyramids. They look like this: lots of children born at the bottom. And as you move up the pyramid, as the population ages and gets smaller, people drop off the population pyramid, as they always do. We all do. And you see that the population is dominated by a youthful bias. What we're seeing these days, though, is exactly the opposite. And in fact, to make this flipped pyramid more accurate, we should probably take one of those gentlemen off the top of it, and we should probably add another dog or a cat. So this is a population pyramid, and it's the American population pyramid. So the median age of Americans today, that is half the population is older and half the population is younger, is 38. Live to the age of about 77. About 60, almost a fifth of the population of the United States is 65 years of age or older. Fertility rate, as I said before, is 1.6. Peak fertility, around 4, as I was mentioning before, in 1959. Took place a year later in Canada, but around the same time. And the United States dropped below replacement rate in 1972, which is why you see something that doesn't look like a pyramid. It actually looks like a vase. And that's because there's fewer children being born, and the baby boom is working its way up through the population pyramid. And you see an expansion at the top as people live longer. So if that's the United States, this is Japan. The median age in Japan is 50. Even if it wanted to reverse its fertility deficit, it does not have a population that's capable of doing it. They are in a population trap. They live to the age of 85. 30% of the population is 65 years of age or older. Their fertility rate's 1.3. The fertility peaked around the same time as the United States, but at a lower level in 1950, and they dropped below replacement rate much earlier than the United States did it in 1960. There's a reason that Japan is obsessed with service robots. It's because it has no young people. This is China. The median age in China today is actually a year older than in the United States. They live about the same age as the average American. Slightly fewer are 65 years of age or older, but their fertility rate is much lower than the United States. They had a higher peak fertility in 1963, but they dropped below replacement rate in 1991, and they continue to decline every year. And as I said before, the Chinese population is now starting to shrink. Here's India. It looks like a population pyramid. Median age much younger, a decade younger than China and the United States. Don't live as long. That's why we don't have as many people over the age of 65. They're now below replacement rate fertility. They peaked in 1965, but they only dropped below replacement rate in 2020. This is why we're going to see a lot of importance placed on India over the space of the next while, because they have a demographic dividend. Now is the time to take advantage of it, particularly relative to their biggest competitor in the world, India or China. This is Nigeria, completely different situation. Their median age is 20 years younger than the United States, but they don't live as long. That's why there's hardly anybody over the age of 65 in Nigeria. The fertility rate remains high, but it's declining as well. As you can see, their peak fertility was around 7 in 1979. They've never dropped below replacement rate fertility. So the world is going through all of these things in different degrees at different times. Some are more advanced and some are less advanced in the direction of that population curve that I showed you before, but all of them are eventually heading in the same direction. Some are already there, Japan being a prime example. So where to from here? We are going to be going through a period where it's going to be like falling down a mountain in the dark. So if you look at the growth of population over time, as we went from 2 billion in around 1950 to 8 billion today, so many things were unpredictable, particularly things like the emergence of youth culture, the emergence of youth music, the emergence of youth fashion, youth entertainment, all things oriented towards youth and starting of families and building of populations, all took place during the baby boom, and a lot of it was unexpected. The baby boom itself was unexpected. But now we're going down the other side, and just as it was unexpected on the way up, it will be equally unexpected on the way down. What's going to happen? Very hard to say. I'll give you a few clues as we wrap this up, but it is really going to be like falling down a mountain in the dark. We are the first species in the history of this planet who's ever decided to call Charles Darwin a liar. We've decided that we don't want to participate in creating the next better generation. We're not competing to do it. In fact, we're generally doing exactly the opposite. We lack an interest in creating the next future generation. And the effect of that is the decline, as I've suggested here, where we fall down a mountain in the dark. These are the top 10 countries by population in the world today in 2017 to where more recent projections suggest they're going to go. The Chinese population is going to drop to third, and they're going to lose almost half of their population this century. Take that on board. Half. India is also going to lose a population almost the size of the United States today. The United States population today is just over 300 million people. India is going to lose about 300 million people near the end of the century. And what you're going to see is you're going to see the rise, mostly, of countries in Africa. So the world will grow fewer, which means we're going to have a global population bust. We're going to reach between 8 and 9 billion by 2050, 2060, and then we're going to start to decline. And we're likely to end the century with a population about the same size as it is today, if not smaller. Our growth is coming from aging and in certain countries from immigration. The United States and Canada are two places, along with Australia and a few others that really do benefit from immigration. We're going to see a dramatic shift in population structure. We're going to be much older with diminishing fertility, and we're going to have smaller families. In fact, in many countries, the most rapidly growing, in my country, in Canada, the most frequent family now, household structure, is a person living by themselves. We're going to see the increasing power of older women in the world because there's going to be a lot more of them. We're becoming a metropolitan species, and the countryside is emptying. We're going to see the decline of China, which makes China very dangerous through the course of particularly the next 20 years. And we're going to see the rise of India and Africa as we go through the century. All of this, if you're concerned about the environment and climate change, all has to be seen as good. If you reduce the size of the denominator in the climate equation, then that equation is about the effect of human activity on climate and the environment. If you reduce the number of people, it has to be good for the environment. But we're going to have huge challenges for the economy. If you go from 2 billion to 8 billion over the space of less than 100 years, like we did following the Second World War, you can see where the world's wealth and growth came from. It came from increasing population. When you go in the other direction, the effect is the opposite. So as the population declines, we're going to start to see negative economic effects in the area, particularly of consumption. We spend a lot of time talking about the issue of labor. In some ways, that's the easier problem to solve, whether it's through mechanization, artificial intelligence, maybe offering people who are older incentives to stay in the workplace. There are all sorts of things that you can do to deal with the labor issue. It's the consumption problem that's going to be the big issue, because consumption drives growth. And older people do not consume, they hoard. They don't buy new cars. They don't buy new houses. They don't do all those things that you do when you're starting your family. Instead, they sit on their resources. This is going to become a huge economic challenge, and it will be mitigated through the political process, which increasingly, I think, on the issue of generations is going to become fractious and problematic. We're going to go through 2 big decades of disruption: the Great Retirement, which is going to start in 2030, that's when every boomer is going to be 65 years of age or older. Then we're going to go through the Great Decline, and that's the final decade of the boomers, the 2040s. And once the decline starts, it's impossible to predict when, how, and at what level it will end. That's why, to me, it's like falling down a mountain at the dark. We don't know what bottom looks like. So you have a series of options. You can accept it and prepare for the inevitable. That's what I would recommend that every business, every investor, every government needs to start preparing for. Because as I said before, the decisions that lead to the outcomes that I'm talking about have mostly already been made. We're just living through them. Mechanization helps you to solve the production problem, the labor force problem. That's what the Japanese do. They offshore a lot of their manufacturing because they lack their own workforce, or increasingly they're starting to mechanize. And they're one of the largest, or actually the world's largest user of robots in every part of their economy. So this is one thing that Japan is pointing to the future on. All of those things, particularly when you add it together with artificial intelligence, there's an opportunity to offset the labor force loss. But just getting more efficient at manufacturing things that people don't need doesn't really lead to economic growth. We need to rethink retirement. We can't afford it. And also the older population is living a lot healthier and doesn't necessarily want to retire in many instances. What kind of incentives are we going to have to keep people in the workplace rather than to retire? And the last probably great prejudice that we have in the world is ageism. What are we going to do about that in the workplace? Because we're going to need the older folks to hang around for longer. And finally, rethink immigration. In some countries it works. In a lot of countries, it's incredibly problematic from a political perspective and increasing in terms of the difficulty. You're just going to see in the United States this issue play out at the top rank of the issues that are going to be mitigated or dealt with during the course of this election. And we're seeing that in other places too. In France, the recent French election definitely was affected by that. The European parliamentary elections were affected by that. So countries are going to have to get immigration right, because they do need skilled people to be able to come to their country, because they're not creating them. So anyway, that is Empty Planet. I'd be happy to turn it now back to the moderator, and I'd be pleased to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Bricker. It is question time, as Dr. Bricker, he's asked us to call him Daryl, so from now on, I'll call him Daryl. Remember, you can ask any questions using the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And well, since I have the virtual floor, I'm going to ask actually a couple of questions. Daryl, I took demography in '93 at university, and there was no talk about this. It was talk about China and India are going to overpopulate the planet more or less. Has this changed? I mean, this is a seismic paradigm shift, at least from my point of view. Is that the reaction you've been getting from people who've been reading your book?
You know, when the book first came out, it came out, I think in the first edition about 4 years ago or 5 years ago. The reaction was either the one that you just had, or people thinking that it was eccentric, to put it politely, because there was such a powerful view in the world. As I said before, even in popular culture, I mean, Soylent Green is people. You know, Thanos and Guardians of the Galaxy has to get rid of half the universe's population because we're overpopulated. You can go through all of these popular memes that exist out there about overpopulation. You know, Brave New World, all of these things, and it's such a powerful image for human beings that we've just bought into it. So when you come to people and you say, actually, as Mark Twain would say, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that's wrong, that really does. When you give them that and you give it to them with data, it's very confounding. And you usually go through all the stages of grief that, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about, denial and anger and all. So you get people at all those various types of stages. But the data on this are compelling. And when you start getting into it, it's pretty hard to deny where we're headed. As I said, you can disagree with the speed at which it's going to happen.
Sure.
You can disagree about what the size is going to be, but everybody agrees that the direction of travel that I mentioned in this presentation and we talked about in An Empty Planet is where we're headed. There's no disagreement about that.
Yeah, again, unbelievable. So the most famous demography, I guess, edict from a government would be the Chinese one-child rule, which occurred for quite some time. One of our viewers, Michael Harrington, asks, why is China's declining population dangerous?
Well, it's dangerous because declining empires are dangerous. And if China is going to be able to, if it has any imperial aspirations, they probably have to be getting at them while their population's still young enough to be able to actually execute it. That's the problem. Old populations. I mean, one of the topics I sometimes talk about is the geriatric peace. Old populations are not fighting populations, right. But unstable empires are always dangerous, and that's why China's declining population is dangerous. And from an internal perspective, the reason that it's dangerous is China is going to get very old before it's rich enough to be very old. So they're going to have a lot of internal problems that they're going to be dealing with related to an aging population, because China doesn't really have a state welfare system, doesn't really have a huge state pension system. Basically, aging parents are taken care of by their children. Well, what are you going to do if you have no children? Right. Or if you only have one to take care of two parents? It's going to be very, very difficult in China, and that's why whenever I hear, and I did another presentation like this in Banff at the Global Economic Forum, and had an economist come on just before me and talk about how China is going to dominate the 21st century economically, and my reaction was, how?
Right. It's also lack of a working force, and it's lack of working force as well, right?
Right, and they don't have the technological capability. So what's going to happen is you're going to start to see what existed in China start to move to other places, but it's not going to be easy to do. Maybe you're going to be able to do it to a certain extent in India because you have a more of an educated population. But the legal systems, the business processes, and other things aren't as highly regulated as they are in China. It's harder to do business in India. It's an interesting place to do business. And if India is interesting, Africa, where there's an actual absolute population surplus, is even harder. because you have a less educated population, and the structures that you need for normally functioning things like factories, like the legal structures, the educational structures, the security structures, don't exist.
Sure. Well, sticking with China and India, Dan Johnson asks, isn't population density in countries like China and India an issue, as there are so many people that are food insecure, and therefore fewer people over time can be a positive development?
Yeah, I accept most of the food insecurity that exists in the world today is as a result of politics. I mean, the famines that exist in the world are not as a result of our ability in the world to create food. Our problem is a distribution problem, and it's really created by the political situation in a number of countries. Some of it's probably related to climate change, no doubt about that, but it can be offset by other places that are able to produce things. And as a result, I think that famine is really more of a political issue than it is a population issue or a science issue. That we can, if we could all get along and we could learn a way to distribute what we're able to create more seamlessly, we wouldn't have starvation in the world.
So the amount of food is enough for the world's population. It's just getting it to them.
Well, easily, right? So where are the big famines these days? Sudan. Okay. Well, what's going on in Sudan? A civil war. Where are they having problems distributing food in the Middle East? Well, Gaza. It's
Sure.
basically a military issue. Any place that if anybody wants to point out a famine, we can usually look at the political cause.
Okay. Daryl, Heather Whitenbach, hope I got that right. Heather, where do you feel countries like Japan and South Korea should intervene to continue to exist?
They're desperately trying. They're desperately trying. But the problem is they're now caught in what's called the low fertility trap. Once you drop as low as they've dropped, you're not going in the other direction. And it's because the population structure won't allow it to happen. So the only thing that they can do in the short term is start looking at immigration. And in both places, immigration and cultural assimilation is incredibly difficult. Although Japan's trying to change the way that it deals with immigrants and is trying to become more immigrant friendly, but it's the type of change that a lot of Japanese will resist. So the way people who are university educated and intelligent tend to look at this issue is as a market failure issue.
Sure.
Right? It's a market failure problem because children are too expensive to raise today. And you can look at all the factors, housing, how long they stay home and all the rest of it. And also the process that I was describing before about women participating in the formal economy and the need to have education, if we could, and not to have their careers interrupted by by having families. If we could just deal with that motherhood penalty, if we dealt with these two problems, then we would deal with this and people would have more kids, except they don't. And in every country in which they put maximum effort into this, and the Nordic countries are the best example, all of them are below replacement rate and declining. Canada, my country, 4 years ago, put in place a national childcare program for $20 a day childcare. Now, it's not as well distributed as it should be and not acting as it should be, but it's a step, you would argue, in the right direction. Our fertility rate has gone from 1.6 to 1.3. And the reason is because it's not market failure. It's people just saying the two most biggest reasons that people don't have kids are as follows. Number one, I just don't want them. I just don't want them.
Interesting.
Now they'll have some people will say it's because of climate change and other things. They don't want to bring kids in the world. I wonder if that's a sort of an after the fact justification. But they just don't want them. I'd rather just have an extra vacation, or I'd rather just focus on my needs, or I'd rather just do I'd rather retire early, or I'd rather do these other things than have kids. I'm fine by myself, or I'm fine with my partner. That's how I want to live. The second reason is I can't have them.
Sure.
And that's a function of people waiting for a long time to start their families. And once you cross that number, that age of 30 for women, every year it gets harder and harder and harder and harder. So if you wait, then your ability to actually meet the desire to have children declines. So those are the two big reasons. And then when you start getting into third and fourth and fifth reasons, there are things like the cost and other things. But the two big reasons are I don't want them and I can't have them.
Those are tough to turn around, aren't they?
Very tough.
Yes. You mentioned service robots are popular in Japan due to a lack of, a working class, more or less. With a declining population, will we need as many creative ways as possible to get the services we need? And that raises the question, is AI good or bad for this problem, or does it even matter?
Well, I think, everything that we can do on the technology front, as I said in the presentation, we've got to be trying because unless we decide that we want to compete to create the next better generation, unless we want to
Right.
get back to where we were during the baby boom. And there are some people who do argue that that's what we should do. There's a group that I like to call the neonatalists. You see them in the United States. You're even seeing them at the Republican convention. I mean, J.D. Vance has been talking about this. Go home and have kids, and we need to do things to improve people's abilities to have children. So there is a movement. Elon Musk is probably the person who's seen as most prominent in this. That people really just need to get back to being fruitful and multiplying. The problem is, it looks an awful lot like the United States in the 1950s, which certainly, or Canada in the 1950s and 1960s. But while it deals with the population issue and the production of people issue, from a personal choice issue, I can't see women going back to living in that world.
Right.
It's kind of a nostalgia that just isn't really possible. But it leads to really interesting questions about how this is all going to be dealt with through the political process, because it is going to be dealt with the political process. So you're seeing these neonatalists start to rise, but on the other side, you're seeing the degrowthers who say basically fewer people's better. How small it is, I don't know, but fewer is better. They usually say around 2 billion. So they celebrate all of this stuff. And then you've got those poor technocratic, sort of liberal, better educated people who look at this as a market failure problem, who are in the middle, who are trying all of these experiments and failing.
Sure.
So that's basically where we are. So yeah, robots, technology, anything that we can do to deal with it, because solving the other problem, we don't seem to be very good at it.
Since you're Canadian, you may, hopefully you have this answer. Generation X has been warned that the baby boomers would exhaust Social Security. So far, it's still intact with birth rates waning in the US. Is there a point where this assumed benefit will no longer be feasible?
Yeah, we're going to have really difficult discussions about the allocation of public resources. Like, do we build an aircraft carrier, or do we support public pensions?
Right.
Right. I mean, there's going to be big discussions about how you distribute money on that basis. What about education? Like, all this investment that we have in education for fewer and fewer kids. So where's that money going to go? So there's going to be a really interesting debate over, interesting is a polite way of describing it, very difficult debate between generations about how we're going to allocate public resources and who's responsible for paying for it, and how you access the funds to be able to support something like Social Security. Because when that pyramid flips, that group down at the bottom doesn't have the wherewithal to pay for all of the stuff up here. And we're even seeing this, for example, in questions like real estate these days and housing, and the younger generation being as frustrated as they are about their inability to live the middle class dream that they feel that they were promised. And it's going to have generational friction points, and one of them is going to be pensions.
Sure. To follow up on that, one of our viewer questions, does this mean we have to take a look at increased longevity differently than we currently do?
Well, that's what Brave New World said. You only get to a certain age, and then, but there are people who say that this is the case, that we should be thinking about it, and I'm not one of them. But medically assisted dying is a growing issue.
Sure.
More demand for it, and what the conditions are to say that somebody should be considering medically assisted dying, I think is going to be one of those issues that we deal with. Similarly, the abortion issue is really one that's driven by the rights of the unborn or the rights of mothers to make potential mothers to make decisions about the future. Maybe at some point the state's going to have an interest in making sure they preserve just the numbers of people that are coming into the population. It's all, honestly, Jason, it's all very, very fraught. It's a really complicated political values type of discussion that almost nobody's having.
Exactly.
But we're having it today at the Badger Club, which is cool.
We certainly are. Futurists need to take a hold of this deal and figure some things out. I believe you meant, did India have economic incentives for kids? I may have misheard that. Okay.
The other direction.
Okay. So this leads into a question from, again, David Larkin from our viewers. Economic incentives have been unsuccessful in increasing fertility rates in other countries. Are there other policies or incentives that could increase fertility?
Not so far.
Not so far.
Everything's marginal. There's only one country that's managed to get itself above the replacement rate in the developed world, and it's Israel.
Okay.
But for all the reasons that probably that one can think about. But it's one of the most studied to see if there's a way to do it. But I mean, Viktor Orban in Hungary right now, if you have 4 kids, you never pay taxes again. If you start your family earlier, that has an effect on your reduction in taxes. If you have multiple children, that has an effect on things. So they're using everything they can to try and increase fertility in their country, including nationalizing in vitro fertilization and making it a state asset. And where's Hungary's fertility been going?
Sure. And just like you said, those first 2 factors of having kids or decisions, those can't be changed by incentives, right?
Yeah, what we're up against, and this is what John Ibbotson and I argue in Empty Planet, we're up against cultural change. That's basically what it is. We've created a culture in which we've said, that primary motivation for existence, which is to create to compete to create the next better generation, which is all what evolution is all about. We've decided,
right,
not us.
We haven't really talked about Brazil and South America. You mentioned in your book that it took Europe quite a time to get from stage 1 to stage 5, or at least look at it, but it's taken Brazil just 2 generations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Brazil's gone from, I think it was the birth rate is somewhere around 6 to somewhere around 1.8 in my lifetime. And the reason for that is massive urbanization combined with, it's an interesting phenomena, and you see it in a few places, but Brazil is the one we talk about, where people do have kids, but they have small families. In fact, they still get married fairly early and they have their first child early, but then they stop. And the reason is it has one of the highest levels of cesarean sections per capita in the world and the highest levels of female fertilization after cesareans.
Interesting. Okay.
Cultural.
If you had your druthers, Daryl, at a macro level, this is from Dan Johnson again, do you think there's an optimum number of people in the world that would be perfect for resources, economic growth, etc.?
I think that it is an interesting idea to think about, but when I have these conversations with people about the ideal size of population, normally they sort of push it back to 2 billion, like what it was in the early 1950s. And to which my answer though is that 2 billion doesn't look anything different, anything like the next 2 billion.
Sure.
That 2 billion is much more rural, much more able to reproduce itself, much younger. This 2 billion is overwhelmingly urban, overwhelmingly aged, and incapable of reproducing itself. So it's not actually the number, it's the structure. What's the ideal structure of the population in order for the world's population to get to an optimal level and be able to replace itself? And the reality is that nobody knows.
Understood. You mentioned immigration policy by Canada and US is helping keep them economically sound. What is a good version of an immigration policy that you've seen or at least have heard theorized?
Well, in Canada, we did have a good system, and we've no longer do. But we did have a good system that was based on almost looking at immigrants as recruits.
Right.
So what we did was we recruited people. We had a points-based system to be able to bring in people based on, in an accelerated way, based on their skills and their ability to assimilate to Canada.
Mhm.
And what's happened over the last while is as our fertility rate has collapsed, as I said before, Canadian fertility is 1.3, like Japan. As our fertility has collapsed, we've opened the doors quite wide in a pretty unstructured way, particularly for people like temporary workers and students who end up not leaving after their education. Some people might regard that as a good thing, and in a structured way it is, but in Canada, that's not what we're experiencing right now. But what it's done, because Canadian culture, and I'm speaking mostly about English Canadian culture, French Canadian culture is somewhat different on this, but English Canadian culture is not very defensive about change. Like if to say what is Canadian, if you're an English Canadian, is a little hard because I'm speaking to you and I have a bit of a different accent, but it's usually a little hard to tell that I'm different, right? And as a result, Canadians don't really feel that they're defending that. The English Canadians don't feel that they're defending that much, so they're quite supportive of immigration. But that's changed of late, and the reason is because there's been a huge amount of immigration. It's come in and it's really affected real estate prices and access to housing. So reasonable people have become negative about immigration because of the economic effects and the competition with immigrants, particularly for housing.
Sure.
So, an example of what used to be a well-structured immigration process that isn't working anymore because we became too less thoughtful in terms of how we were going to manage it.
Okay, we're coming up to the top of the hour, Daryl. One last question from our viewers. Greg Carl asks, are there projections as to when the world population might collapse?
Well, define collapse. I mean,
Sure.
it's nobody, as I said before, nobody really knows. But once we reach that peak, we all want to think that it's going to just kind of slowly go down. But it did when it didn't slowly go up. It went from 2 to 8 in less than 100 years.
Right.
So what happens when it goes from 8 to 2? As I said before, it's like falling down a mountain in the dark. Nobody knows. And when you get to that level, whatever it's going to be, does that structure of a population actually have the ability to maintain itself? And that's an interesting question. We've never faced it in history, human history, ever, but we're going to find out.